All right, Rabbi, say good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Such a schus to be able to begin the new Zman together after Yom Tovim. Feels like we should begin with a song, but all right, maybe the. Okay, good. I'll go with the sponsorships. Okay, so we'll say so. Want to begin by thanking. Excuse me. Today's sponsor are our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei. Avraham and Shaindy Kelman for dedicating all the shur memory of their parents. Jack Bennett for dedicating the shurim this month in memory of Givati Brigade First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport. Excuse me. And Dr. Linda Weinberg for dedicating the shiurim this month in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg Peretz Moshe ben Avraham David. The Daf Yomi shir today is sponsored by Alan and Sue Myrowitz in memory of their friend Jere Sussman, Yaakov, Pesach ben Zalman, and by our mishpacha in memory and commemoration of my grandfather Zichron Livracha's yahrzeit, Menachem Mendel, Levi Dovid HaCohen. We hope that in the merits of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families ein nechamam. And also with that, let us begin. Mazel Tov, brand new parak. Thank you to Rabbi Kalman Akiva for giving shir yesterday. And let us begin. Today's daf is daf Lamed 30. We are picking up at the Mishnah on the bottom of Chaf Tes Amud Beis 29a. An incredible sugya ahead of us today. Says the Mishnah, Hamevi kadiyayim mimakum lemakum. If a person is bringing jugs of wine from one location to another location, lo yevim besal ubakupa. A person should not bring the jugs of wine in a box, or say in a basket, or in a box. Aval maybe wal kseifa o lefanov. But rather he should bring it on his shoulder or carry it in front of him. Now, what's happening over here? If you take a look at Rashi, so Rashi says over here, Lo yevim b'sala b'kupa, Lo says shalosh v'arba b'soch kupa v'yasiyim, mishum denira kima'ased dechol, Lo says masos. Well, so the issue over here is, and we've already seen this theme, and we've already seen this topic before, that to whatever degree we could change up the way we do things on Yom Tiv, we do so. So, for example, normally, if you were going ahead and transporting bottles of wine, how would you do that? You would take a whole bunch of bottles or jugs of wine, and you would place them in a box or in a basket. Right? So all the Mishnah is saying over here is that when you are transporting these bottles of wine, these jugs of wine on Yom Tiv, do so with a shinui. In other words, I don't mean like a shinui, like a hilchos Shabbos shinui, but rather just transport them in a different way. So, for example, the Mishnah is carry it on your shoulder, or go ahead and just carry a couple of bottles in front of you. So too, if one is carrying straw on Yom Tiv, lo yafshil esakupa la'achorov. He should not go ahead and carry the bundle of straw behind him. Now, if you look at Rashi says, V'china esateven. Now, why are you carrying straw on Yom Tiv? So Rashi says, lehesek o lebehema. Either to kindle a fire, right? Straw is used for fuel, or for animal feed. Lo yafshil kupa la'achorov. Diginai Yom Tov Shenira Kimiskavin Lemelocha Rabba. See, Rabbi say straw is an item that was normally transported in bulk. So if you're carrying straw behind you, it looks like you are readying yourself to do a lot of malacha. Or that you're transporting the straw a large distance, like one would during the week. So if you want to transport your straw, Lo Yafshil Sakupa Lachorav. Do not carry the basket of straw behind you, aval meviahu biyado, but rather again hold it in your hands. So, right, so as normally during the week you would take a bundle of straw, carry it behind your back. On Yom Tiv, carry it in front of you. So, umaschilin, top of Lamed, excuse me, umaschilin ba'aremas hataven. Avalo be'etzim sheba muktzah. I will say now this is an interesting part of the Mishnah. So literally translated, you could begin using a pile of straw. Now if you look at the top Rashi on Lamed Amud Aleph, umaschilin bi'aremas hataven. So Rashi says lahesek. So in other words, if you now want to go ahead and use straw to fuel the fire, and you have a brand new straw pile, you can go ahead and begin using from that straw pile on Yom Tiv. Now what's the chiddush? Rashi says, Va'afa pishel zimna mi ba'od yom. even though you did not go ahead and set aside this pile of straw from before Yom Tiv, and you would not normally use that pile of straw for fuel, to which Rashi says, "V'hashta mashma delesli muktzah." So I will say this phrase seems to reflect a more, we'll call it a less restrictive view, a more permissive view of muktzah, because what it's saying is that even though I did not set aside this pile of straw to use before Yom Tiv, and even though I would not normally take from this pile to go ahead and fuel my fire, I'm allowed to take from it on Yom Tiv. We'll see in the Gemara. Mishnah ends, avalo be'etzim shebemuktzah. But you cannot go ahead and take from the wood in the muktzah. What's the word in the muktzah? Rashi says, avalo be'etzim muktzah, rach b'shachori habatim kriya muktzah. We'll say muktzah was the name of like a storage shed that people had behind their homes. It's fascinating. We think of muktzah as a halachic category or halachic framework, but muktzah technically, at least in Lashon of the Mishnah, referred to like a storage area a person would have behind their house. Al shimshu muktzah la'achar ve'in nichnasim v'yatzim bo tadir v'sham nosten eitzim v'chol davar shein daito litol ad zman meruba. They both say muktzah was the name of a storage area where you would keep stuff that you wouldn't really access regularly. Stuff that you weren't really going to use on a regular basis. So I'll say, so now, the Mishnah, so what's interesting about this already, you see, is the Mishnah just said that you could take straw from a pile that you did not designate before Yom Tiv, and then in the next breath, the Mishnah says, but you can't take wood from the muktzah. Now, Bepashtos, why can't you take wood from the muktzah? Why not? Why not? Because it's set aside for non-use. So it's interesting. We'll reconcile these two statements in the Gemara. Good, I'll say, says the Gemara, Tana, im ef shlashanas mutter. So we'll say, now, focusing on the first part of the, is the microphone working okay? Hear me okay?
I think it's
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
It's good. Whoever set this up this morning did an incredible job, by the way. All right, so let's say, so the first part of the Mishnah taught us that when going ahead and transporting something on Yom Tiv, one should do so with a shinui. One should do so in a different way. So now the Gemara says, Tana, im efshar l'shanos mutter. Let's say you're doing something, and just the nature of the activity, we'll give examples of this, doesn't lend itself to being done in a different way. Okay, so if you can't be meshana, if you can't do it with a shinui, fine. So the Gemara says, Askin Rava b'mechuza. So the Gemara gives examples of this. So Rava instituted the following practices in the city of Mechuza. The dara b'duchka, the dara b'ragla. If you normally carry something during the week on your shoulder, on Yom Tiv, you should carry it with a pitchfork. Let's say, so some of these things are very interesting because they sound a little bit counterintuitive, but Rashi points out there's less effort exerted with carrying something with a pitchfork than on your shoulder. The dara b'ragla, Lidru ba'agra. If you normally carry something with a pitchfork, then on Yom Tiv, ultimately carried ba'agra. We'll say agra is a pole that two people would put on their shoulders and carry the item like that. Lidara ba'agra, lidara ba'achba. Ultimately, again, if you go ahead and you normally carry something with a pole with two people, so on Yom Tiv, lidara ba'achba, carry it with a pole for one person. The dara ba'achba nifros sudra layu. If something is already carried on a pole that's carried by one person, put a cloth over it. Okay, so we'll say, so you see over here, these are not per se halachic ideas. This is Rava's attempt in Mechuzah to say, guys, whatever you do during the week, do it differently on Yom Tiv. Ve'im lo afshar shari. Rava will say, if there's no reasonable way to make a shinui, then you don't have to worry about it. The Amar Mar, im efshar l'shanos mutter. If you cannot change, in other words, if there's no way to deviate, then ultimately it's mutter. Amar li Rav Chanan bar Rava lo Rav Ashi, Amar Rabbanan. We'll say, listen to this phrase. Rav Chanan bar Rava said to Rav Ashi, the Rabbanan used to say, Kama de efshar l'shanuye mishaninan biyama tova. As much as a person could go ahead and change, as much as you can make a shinui, ultimately, again, that's what one should do on Yom Tiv. I will say, I just want to tell you something. What an incredible and overwhelming phrase to begin this new Zman of our limud with. Well, so listen, you understand what the phrase is? Kama the efshar l'shinoi mishnei yom tova. So perhaps you could read it like this. What's a Yom Tov? What's a Yom Tova? A Yom Tov is any day of Kama de Efshar l'shinui mishaninon. Any day in which you affect maximum change. Any day in which you take advantage of your opportunities to evolve. Any day in which you see the opportunities of life to self-actualize, that's a Yom Tov. Kama de Efshar l'shinui mishaninon. Any day when you take advantage of your opportunity to be Mashana, to change yourself, Yom Tova. That's a Yom Tov. See, we think Yom Tov is over. But it's not true. Every single day is a Yom Tov if you take advantage of the opportunity to change. See, Rabbi said Yom Tov is ripe for change. Why? Because the truth is, the beauty of Yom Tov is there's nothing else going on, right? There's nothing else. There's really nothing else to distract me, right? Or it's just me, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, tefillah, learning, family, hopefully, Meretz Hashem. So Yom Tov lends itself to change. But the truth is that power, that cathartic power of change on Yom Tov could be harnessed any day that a person goes ahead and chooses to change. The Rabbi said, listen to this. So what happens if a person says, I can't change? What happens if a person, I can't change. This is who I am. So you know what the Gemara says? It was the first line of the Gemara. The Gemara says, Imi efshar l'shanos mutter. Okay, if you can't change, it's mutter to be who you are. Rabbi say, but that statement is said sarcastically. Fine. You say it's not possible to efshar l'shanos? Fine, mutter. Mutter lach, like Hataras Nadarim. But Hataras Nadarim is not a real mechanism either, right? We kind of do it, but at the end of the day, mutter. So that's how Chazal starts. Some people who want to say change is impossible. If you live your life like that, I guess it's mutter to settle for mediocrity. I guess it's mutter. But the better way to live life is kol efshar kama defshar l'shnei mishaniyon. The more you could take advantage of the opportunity to change, Yom Tova. That's a good day. Halavai should be a good day for all of us. Vahani nashi dekamayin chatzbayu maya b'Yom Tova. Listen to this. So the Gemara gives examples of situations where it doesn't make sense to change the way something is done. Here's a good example. The women who fill up the buckets of water on Yom Tov. V'lo mikashaninan. They both say they don't fill up the buckets in an abnormal way. In other words, there's no shino in the way they change the buckets. So listen to this. V'lo amrina lahu v'lo midi. And no one says, so understand, you fill up the bucket by the river, you bring the bucket home. The Pashtos, that's like a case in the Mishnah of bringing the jugs of wine, bringing the jugs of oil, where the Mishnah says you should change the way you carry the jugs. So B'Pashtos, you would think that we should tell the women they should change the way they carry the buckets of water. But yet they don't change the way they carry the buckets, and no one says anything. Listen to this. That's because it doesn't make sense to tell them to do it differently. Why not? So let's go through this. What are the possibilities? If normally during the week they have huge large buckets, so we should tell them what? On Yom Tiv to use smaller buckets? Both say if they use smaller buckets, then what happens? More trips. That doesn't make sense. So if they normally use small buckets, they tell them they should use large buckets. That doesn't make sense. Why? Ultimately, again, that'll just cause a greater burden. It'll be heavier buckets. To tell them to go ahead and maybe during the week they carry the buckets uncovered, right? So maybe on Yom Tiv they should carry the buckets with a lid. Here's the problem, is that perhaps ultimately the lids will fall off and they'll come to carry it. Now both say, now the carrying is not a problem of carrying on Yom Tiv, that's going to be permitted. The problem is a problem of masu, just an extra burden, extra thing to carry. Tikterei, so maybe we'll tell them no problem, carry the buckets with a lid on it, but tie the lid to the top of the bucket. Zimnin demafsik va'asil mikterei. Sometimes the lid will become detached, and they'll come to tie the lid on the bucket. The Rabbi said, now what's the problem with tying the lid on the bucket? What's the problem? The malacha of kshira, of kosher, of tying something, kesher shal kayamo, a knot that will last. Tifros sudre aleh, a little smichas chaver chazara. So maybe you'll say, no problem, spread a cloth over the bucket, cover it. No. Zimnin demakmish b'maya va'asi lidei schita. What's the problem? If you go ahead and you place a cloth over the bucket, what's going to happen? Sometimes it'll become saturated with liquid. It'll become saturated, right, with water, and ultimately you will come to squeeze it out. Hilchach lo efshar. So we'll say, so this is very important. This is very important that you see that sometimes, as much as we want a shinui to occur, halacha l'maisa, if it doesn't make sense, we leave it alone. So we'll say, if you think about it, it's also such an incredible metaphor in life. There are certain things in life that I know are imperfect. There are certain things in life that I know there should be maybe some type of tikkun. But then when you go through the possibilities, there's no better way for certain something to occur. In other words, sometimes life is about accepting the imperfections in the circumstances and recognizing that a certain level of imperfection is par for the course. That's how it's going to happen. See over here, Gemara says, I know we should change the way we carry the buckets. Because that's what the Mishnah said. You should be mishana in the way that you perform any physical activity on Yom Tiv. What are you supposed to do? We can't. There's nothing to do. So sometimes in life, as much as we just said before, that going after change and affecting change every day makes the day into a Yom Tiv, there are certain things and certain situations in life where I have to accept a certain level of imperfection. An incredible Yisrael. Amalei Rav Avarav Chanel Abaye. Tanan, both say this is a great sugya. Now, what I want to point out, this sugya actually appears in 6 days from now on Daf Lamed Vav. But we're going to do it a little bit now. And the timing of it is incredible. Listen to this. Tanan, ein metapchin, ve'ein mesapkin, ve'ein merakdin. What's the halacha? We don't clap. That's metapchin is clap. Mesapkin is hitting your hand against your leg. Ve'ein merakdin, and we don't dance on Yom Tiv. On Yom Tiv. This timing of this absolutely incredible. Now what's the pshat? What's wrong? Why can't you dance, clap, or do anything? Rashi says, Meraktin, Beragav, Kulam Nasru, this is Yom Tiv Shabbos. V'kulam Nasru Mishum Shvus. Gzeira Shema Yitakin Klei Shir. So we'll say, we saw this sugya in Shabbos. We're going to see this sugya again on Daf Lamed Vav. But we'll say this is fascinating. So Chazal instituted, you can't clap, you can't dance on Shabbos, lest you come, because you may come to go ahead and fix an instrument. Okay? So the Gemara says, but people clap and people dance on Shabbos. And no one says anything, right? The rabbis don't object. So the Gemara says, the truth is, going according to that reasoning, in other words, other practices that people do that are asr, and yet the rabbanim don't object. Hada amarava lo leisiv inish apuma delechya dilma mignadar lechefetz va'asila asuye dalar amos v'shusra. Both listen to this case. Chazal said, a person should not sit at the edge of the lechi. So just to illustrate this, just a moment, we know this from our Eruvin days. You have a mavui, you have an alleyway. The halacha is that even if the alleyway is closed on 3 sides, you have to make a lechi or a korah at the entranceway of the mavui, a vertical beam, a horizontal beam, to demarcate between the alleyway, which is a rishus hayachid midaraisa, and the rishus harabim. So Chazal said, don't sit right by the lechi or the korah. Don't sit by the lechi or the korah. Because why? What's going to happen? You're holding something. You're not going to realize that just a step out of the shusarab, you're going to come to inadvertently go ahead and carry something into the shusarab. By the way, another incredible Musar Haskell, don't live life sitting by the lechi or the korah. It's not just a din in Hilchos Shabbos. It's a din in the way we structure our lives. Sometimes we like to straddle that line between mutter and asr, and it's always a bad idea. Successful spiritual living requires the creation of gidarim, because gidarim, protective fences, create a boundary between myself and between the davar ha'asr. We all have our weak points in life, and if you live life sitting by the proverbial lechi or korah, it is just a matter of time until I find myself on the wrong side of things. So Chazal said, don't live life by the lechi or the korah. Create your boundaries. create your buffers, create your gidarim, so that if you do end up messing up a little bit, you've ventured into the boundary and not beyond it. The Gemara says, "V'hani nashi the shaklin chatzbayu v'azon v'yasan apum damavua." But the women go out and take their barrels, right? They sit down on their barrels right by the lachir, the korah, and what? V'lo amrinu v'lo midi, and the rabbanim don't say anything to them. Yeah, okay. There's a lot to say about this also, right? Good. Well, let's go back there. Ella hanach lehem. I was gonna say that. Okay. No, good. Working on midos. Ella hanach lehem Yisrael mutav shu shogigin va'al yumazidin. Rather, I both say this is incredible. What do you see? You see from here that sometimes, and this is a fascinating halachic concept, that sometimes it is better to let people be a shogig than it is to be a mazid. Now, both say, what does this mean? So it's clear for what the Gemara is saying is as follows. If you look at Rashi says hanach lahem. Now, hanach lahem literally means leave them alone. Leave them alone. Rashi says, "B'davar sheher gilubo v'lo yachzeru bahem." If you see people engaged in a behavior that they have become habituated to, and you know they're not going to change it. So the Gemara says, Chazal made a choice. Leave it alone. Because better to let someone be a shogeg than to tell them that something is asur. They're not going to listen to you anyway, and now they're amazed, and now they're intentional. At least if you're ignorant, you could hide under the shogeg. Right, the reality I'm a shogeg. Once you tell them and they don't listen, now they are a mazid. Rashi says, Gemara says over here, Hakanami, Hanacham Yisrael, Hanacham Yisrael, Mutav Shushogigin, Va'al Yu Mazidin. So I'll say a pretty incredible idea. So first of all, so just so you understand, the Gemara now is applying this in two places. We're not supposed to clap, we're not supposed to dance on Shabbos, but you can't stop Jews from clapping and dancing. So better not to say anything, let them be, although we kind of just blew the hole through this svara through learning this Gemara, right? But let them be shogigin and not mezidin. Good. Second example of that, people really shouldn't sit by the lachir or the korah, but people are going to do it anyway. So better to let them be shogigin and not mezidin. Rabbi say one more example of this. V'hani mili, a very important qualification. V'hani mili b'dirabanan. This concept of just let them be shogigin and not mezidin only applies to dinei d'rabanan. Aval b'da'oraisa lo. But when it comes to biblical law, no. But when it comes to if somebody is transgressing biblical law, there's an obligation of hocheach tocheach hasamisecha. We translate hochacha as rebuke, but rebuke sounds like you're yelling at someone. That's not the mitzvah of tochacha. If somebody's doing something wrong biblically, there may be an obligation to inform them of that. To which the Gemara says, actually, you're wrong. Velohi lo shna b'da'oraisa v'lo shna b'dirabanan. The truth is, both sides, the concept of mutav shu shogigin va'al yu mezidin, that if somebody is steeped in a behavior that they're not going to change, even though the behavior is a biblical violation, and you know that even if you say something to them, they are not going to stop this behavior, better not to say anything to them. Let them be a shogeg and not a mazid. The Gemara says, I'll prove to you it even works by a daraisa. I will say this is wild. Daha. Tosefes Yom Kippurim D'Oraisa. I will say there is a biblical obligation to start Yom Kippur early. There's a biblical obligation. So we start Yom Kippur early, and yet V'ha'achli v'shasu ad chashecha. And yet what? There are people, or communities, where people were eating until it got dark. Remember again, we start Yom Kippur early, before Shkia. But yet, there are communities where people were eating until it got dark. V'lo amrina lehu v'lo midi. And we don't say anything to them. So let's analyze this a little bit. So first of all, halacha l'maisa number one, whatever I could be mishana, wherever I can make a change in any level of physical exertion on Yom Tiv, I should try to do so. But what do we do with this mutav shu shogigin va'al yu mazidin? So listen to this. Again, we'll see this sugi a little bit later on, but I just want to quote you one mara makom. Simin taf reish ches. Halacha Beis, Sif Beis. This is Hilchos Yom Kippurim. So the Shulchan Aruch says as follows. The Shulchan Aruch speaks about the idea. He says, people, Sha'ochos v'shosos ad shechashecha, Vein enon yodos shemitzvah lohosif mechol ala kodesh. People who eat and drink until nightfall, and they don't know the halacha is that you have to start Yom Kippur early, ein memachin biyadon, we don't go ahead and object to their practice, shelo tavou la'asos bizadon, out of concern that they're going to do it anyway, and we don't want them to be amazed. Bosi, listen to the Ramah. So in general, we have this concept that if somebody's doing something wrong, but they're not going to listen to you to stop doing it, better not to say something, let them be a shogeg and not amazed. But, very important qualification. So both say, Gemara proved that this concept applies to both Dinei D'Rabbanan and D'Oraisa. The Ramah advances, it's not the Ramah, it's already earlier, an incredible qualification. V'davka she'eno mefurash b'Torah. Aval, shehu D'Oraisa. Aval mefurash b'Torah, mochin biyadam. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, the Ramah says, when do we say, mutav shu shogigin va'al yu mezizin by D'Oraisa? Only by a d'oraisa that's not explicit. Like, for example, that you should start Yom Kippur early. We learned that out from Josh's Psukim. But if someone is violating something that is a clear, often the pasuk, right, a mefurish pasuk in the Torah, mefurish halacha, then there is an obligation of tochaha. There is an obligation to inform that person of their wrongdoing. Now, I will say, the way you inform a person, how you inform a person, is a very, very, very delicate dance. Because ultimately, again, sometimes if you deliver tochacha in the wrong way, it does more damage than good. And the Ramah discusses this over here. He says about how to give tochacha, how many times you give tochacha, lo yarbe b'tochachas, don't give too much tochacha. But again, I just want to point out, so the concept of mutav shi shogigin, value mezidin, applies halacha l'maisa to the Rabbanans, to the Oraisas, but not to the Oraisas which are explicit. What do we do with the singing and dancing thing? Suppose I take a look at Tosas. This is incredible. Tosas tnan ein mesapkin ve'ein meraktin. So remember, the Gemara says pretty much it's usher to dance and clap today on Shabbos and Yom Tiv, but you know what? No one's going to listen, so just let people do their thing. Tosas says differently. Tosas says tnan ein metapim meraktin perish Rashi shemi atakin kleishir umiu lididan shari. Tosas says that for us it's mutter. Why? The dafka biyameyan shahayu bikian lasos kleishir shayach lemigzar. It was saying it was only in the times of the Gemara where people knew how to make instruments, right? Where the common person could have made an instrument that this gezerah applied. Aval lididan ein anu bikian lasos kleishir v'lo shayach lemigzar. But for us, no one knows how to make instruments, and therefore, again, there's no need for the gzera of not clapping and dancing. So we'll say, so again, this Tosas is what we rely on contemporarily. What I will just plant the seed, we'll do this later on, is this is fascinating. Because we'll say, you could use this logic by a whole bunch of rabbinic gezeros, right? There's a whole number of rabbinic enactments, Dinei D'Rabbanan, that are predicated on a particular reason, and one can make the cogent argument that the reason no longer applies. Yet, the way the legal system is set up is that even if the reason doesn't apply, the halacha remains on the books. So, yet, we see sometimes it doesn't. So we see that in the world of Dinei D'Rabbanan, there are different halachas. There are some halachas where the existence of the rabbinic enactment is predicated on we'll call it the prevalence of the reason, and therefore if the reason goes away, the halacha goes away as well. And other halachas which remain on the books independent of whether or not the reason is shayach or not. We'll see this on Lamed Vav when we get to it. Incredible sugya said of us. Incredible says Givati. Says the Gemara Maschina Bare Masat 7. And remember the Mishnah said that you could begin using the pile of straw on Yom Tiv. You could begin using the pile of straw. So the Gemara says, Amrav Kahana, Zosum Res Maschilin, Ba'otzar Tchila. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that you could use something that was put in storage on Yom Tiv. Let me see a little bit differently. It was put in storage before Yom Tiv. So even though it was put in storage, normally when you put something in storage, what does that indicate? Non-use, right? The long term. I'm not using it. So you see that on Yom Tiv, you could access something in storage. Some money. Rabbi Shimon Leslie Muktzah. Whose opinion? This is Rabbi Shimon, who has a more permissive view of muktzah. Rabbi Shimon does not need something to be actively set aside for use on Erev Yom Tiv. He holds pretty much as long as it's usable on Yom Tiv, you can take it. So on the other hand, Ema Seifa, Avalo be'etzim sheba muktzah. But yeah, what was the next part of the Mishnah? The Mishnah said you can't use the wood in the muktzah, right? In the storage house. Asan Rabbi Huda de Islay muktzah. That reflects the view of Rabbi Huda, who does hold of muktzah. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, no. The case of the muktzah, Rabbi is a different case. This is great. A little chazara hacha, ba'arzi va'ashuchi askinan, the muktzah machmas chisaron kis. Incredible. I'll say, what kind of wood is in the storehouse? It's cedar wood. Both say cedar wood was only used for one thing, which is building. Cedar wood was very expensive wood, and therefore you never used it. Well, the logistics guys are here. Maybe bookcases also. I don't know, desks or something, right? So you wouldn't use cedar wood. You wouldn't use cedar wood ultimately again you wouldn't use it for fuel because you wouldn't use it for fuel. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, it's muktzah machmas chisaron kis, and even Rabbi Shimon, who has a more permissive view of muktzah, agrees with muktzah machmas chisaron kis. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "Va'afilu Rabbi Shimon moda ikudem," which also is very interesting. That even Rabbi Shimon, who takes a more permissive view of muktzah, agrees with muktzah machmas chisaron kis. We'll say muktzah machmas chisaron kis is a category of muktzah. It's interesting. Here, the Gemara is defining muktzah machmas chisaron kis based on what? Based on what? Value. We know that halacha l'maisa, value does not necessarily have to be the only determinant of muktzah machmas chisaron kis. You could have something that has a relatively low dollar value, but has a very important personalistic value. So again, but this is not hilchos muktzah, but you understand the point the Gemara is making. Others go ahead and put this conversation on the seif of the Mishnah. Avalo be'etzim sheba muktzah. You can't use the wood in the muktzah. We're working backwards now. Amar Rav Kahana, zo sameres. So the Mishnah is teaching me, you can't go ahead and take something out of storage on Yom Tiv. Whose opinion is that? Money. Rabbi Hudi. That's Rabbi Huda, the Islay Muktzah. Because Rabbi Huda holds a Muktzah, more restrictive view of Muktzah. What about the first part of the Mishnah? You can begin using a pile of straw on Yom Tiv, Asan Rabbi Shimon. Both say that seems to reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon. The Leslie Muktzah, who has a more permissive view of Muktzah. So which one is it? Hasam betivna sarya. Or both say, what type of straw are we talking about? Decaying straw, rotting straw. Now both say, tivna sarya hachazilatina. Now Rashi says over here, once the straw is decaying, it's not fit for animal food anymore. The only thing it is fit for, ultimately again, is really for fuel. So the Gemara says that's why it's usable on Yom Tiv. The Gemara says, but one second, decaying straw is fit for something else. Chazilatina, you can make it into mortar. You can make it into mortar to fashion bricks. To which the Gemara says the islay kotzim. It has thorns. So because it has thorns, it's not fit for building. It's not fit for animal food. The only thing it's going to be fit for is fuel for your fire. So we'll say, so just two different ways of reading the Mishnah. Either again, from top down or from bottom up, and ultimately yields two different interpretations. Beautiful. Amid Bezer, we'll say, new Mishnah. And we'll say, get ready for this. On Isru Chag. Ein notlim eitzim min hasukah. Ein notlim eitzim min hasukah. We'll say, okay. Should I juggle fire or something? Like what I need to do to get people excited over here? Good. So we'll say, we started shir later today. We started at 5:55. You got a couple of extra minutes of rest. All right. Let's listen to this. You can't take wood from the sukkah on Yom Tiv. Ella min hasamochla. Now the truth is, the Pasha Pshat is, we're going to see now, this is not talking about a sukkah of mitzvah. This is talking about a structure, just a hut, a stam hut. So what the Mishnah is saying is like this. If you have wood, now if you look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says, Rashi says, Kigom bePesach o ba'atzeres v'yoshe b'sukkah begino b'pardes, Einot le'etzem min hasukkah ela min hasamochla. Hashta mashma imhu av shenasnu kanim harbe mutter litom mehem. So we'll say, the Pasha the Gemara is something like this. If you have a lot of extra, we'll call it, I'm going to use the word schach, But again, we're not talking about a sukkah of a mitzvah. We're just talking about a stam hut. I have a hut. So now again, I have some extra thicker schach on my hut. So the Mishnah says, I can't take schach, right, or wood, branches from my schach, from the roof. Ella minas samuchla. Instead, where could I go ahead and put this? Where could I take the wood from? If there are some extra branches by the walls. So I can't take extra branches from the roof, but I can take extra branches ultimately again from the wall. Says the Gemara, okay, Maishna min asukah delo tekasasar ola. So says the Gemara, why can't I go ahead and take extra branches from the roof of the sukkah? Why not? What's wrong with that? Sorry. Why can't I go ahead and do that? So the Gemara says, because when you remove branches from the roof of the sukkah, you are dismantling a structure, right? The act of removing branches from the roof, by definition, is an act of dismantling. So the Gemara says, oh Allah. Okay, if you remove branches from the walls, that's also an act of dismantling. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, my samuch ledefanos. To which the Gemara says we're talking about branches. Rashi says, samuch ledefanos, kanim haniskafim zvivos ledefanos, kevan shelo nergu im hadofen. So we'll say, listen to this. When you are making walls of a hut, what you would do is you would take branches and you would kind of weave those branches together. They would make the structured walls. We're talking about additional branches that are leaning against the wall, but not actually woven into the wall. So Allah Chalamaisa, because they're not woven into the wall, they're just standing next to it. The removal of that on Yom Tiv is not considered to be an act of stira, it's not an act of demolition. Rav Menashe said the truth is, we could even be talking about not branches that are next to the walls, but branches that are laying on the roof. Ki tanyahi be'isuraisa tanya. So what are you talking about? Where a person put bundles of branches on the roof of the sukkah. So you both say, listen to this. If you put a bundle of branches, but you never untied the bundle, those branches essentially are sitting on top of the roof, but don't effectively become part of the roof. So because of that, halacha l'maisa, removing them on Yom Tiv would not be a problem of stira. Tanya Rabbi Chia bar Yosef Kameid Rabbi Yochanan a notlin eitzim min asukah ela min asamuchla. So we'll say, I taught this in a brayse as well. You can't take wood from the roof of the sukkah, but rather min asamuch, from that which is next to it. For Rabbi Shimon matir, Rabbi Shimon permits it. V'shavin, we'll say, here we go. V'shavin besukkah hachag bechag. Now, Rabbi say, we are transitioning to a discussion about a sukkah. Rabbi say, all kidding aside, isn't this incredible that on Isru Chag, we have a sugya about sukkah? Well, I tell you, there's a beautiful Bnei Yissaschar. The Bnei Yissaschar writes, he says that by definition a Jew is always a little bit ba'atzos. A Jew is always a little bit sad when Yom Tovim are over, because again, Yom Tovim are over. We just had a whole month of such a beautiful, magnificent Yom Tiv. Yom Tiv after Yom Tiv, Avod after Avod, Simcha after Simcha. What do you do now when Yom Tiv is over? So the Rebbe says something beautiful. Bnei Yissaschar says, any time you want to experience a Yom Tiv, just learn the halachas of that Yom Tiv. So you want to feel like you're in the sukkah, open up Maseches Sukkah, or open up the Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Sukkah, and when you go ahead and you learn a sugya, you learn a halacha about sukkah, says the Bnei Yissaschar, it's ki'ilu that you are celebrating the Yom Tiv. That's from the Neshamadika perspective. When the Neshama learns the halachas of the Yom Tiv, ultimately there's a quasi-experience of the Yom Tiv as well. So Baruch Hashem Zachinu, that on Isru Chag, which is, Isru Chag still has a little bit of the spark of Yom Tiv, but there's a certain level of sadness now that the next thing we have in our orbit is Chanukah. We have to wait a little bit. But we don't have to wait, because every single time I learn the halachas of the Yom Tiv, I get to experience. So here, Baruch Hashem on Isru Chag, we get to learn a little bit of Hilchos Sukkah. V'shavin b'sukkah sachag b'chag sha'asura. But I will say, everyone agrees that you can't go ahead and utilize the wood of a sukkah on sukkah. So we'll say every part of a sukkah is set aside for non-use. In other words, when I say non-use, obviously you could use it as a sukkah, but you cannot repurpose any part of the actual structure of the sukkah for anything else. But if you made a condition, now we'll discuss the parameters of this, but if you made a condition before Yom Tiv, to be able to use some part of the sukkah on Yom Tiv for non-sukkah purposes, then it would be mutter. Rabbi Shimon, as the Gemara said, Rabbi Shimon matir. Rabbi Shimon says it's mutter. How could it be mutter? How can you take anything out of the structure? You are engaging in an act of stira. Right, so we'll say, what are we talking about over here? A sukkah nofalas, right? Incredible. A sukkah nofalas. Say, isn't it absolutely incredible? Right, so what are we talking about? A sukkah that you know is going to fall down, right? So we're talking about a sukkah that fell down. Well, I should say differently. A sukkah that fell down on Yom Tiv. If the sukkah fell down, Rashi says, "Tishnafla b'Yom Tiv." The sukkah already fell down on Yom Tiv. So because it fell down, Rabbi Shimon then says you could use the parts of the sukkah for something else. For Rabbi Shimon l'tamei, the less muktzah. That was Rabbi Shimon goes according to his reasoning. Rabbi Shimon holds of a more permissive view of muktzah. Rabbi Shimon says once it falls down on Yom Tiv, you're permitted to use it. So the Gemara says this sanya mosa shemen shebekara aser. Rabbi Shimon matir. Both say because Rabbi Shimon says that when you have an air, both remember again whenever we speak about an air, we're referring to what? A receptacle that has oil in it with a lip in which you put the wick. What happens? What happens with the leftover oil in the nair? Rabbi Shimon says you're permitted to use it. Which is incredible. So your nair goes out on Shabbos. Rabbi Shimon says you want to take the rest of the olive oil. You want to make a salad dressing. Rabbi Shimon says ultimately it is permitted. Shabbos say the same Rabbi Shimon who says that you could use the leftover oil also says that what? That if your sukkah collapses on Yom Tiv, you could use the wood for whatever you want. So the Gemara says, how can you compare the cases? Me dummy. Hasam Adam Yoshevu Metzape Emasai Tich Beneiro. We'll say by the case of the Nair, everyone knows that what? The Nair is going to go out. So because everyone knows that the Nair is going to go out, therefore what? I have das that I'm going to use the leftover oil. Hacha Adam Yoshevu Metzape Emasai Tipol Sukaso. Does a person sit on Yom Tiv waiting for their sukkah to collapse? Amrav Nachabar Yitzchak Hacha. We're dealing with a rickety sukkah. We'll say, yes, there are situations like that. We've all been in sukkahs like that. When is this thing going to collapse? Right? We've seen it. So we're talking about a rickety sukkah. So a rickety sukkah, we'll say, where a person knows chances are this is not going to survive the Yom Tiv. According to Rabbi Shimon, that would be like the case of shemen shebener. That would be like the case of the leftover oil, where a person would have das to use it. Ultimately, again, from yesterday, I had in mind that if this sukkah collapses, which in all probability it will, I will be able to go ahead and use the wood for something else. Incredible. So I will say, so the point over here, two halachas that come out of here. Number one, if you happen to have a structure, right? If you have a structure and there are additional pieces of wood laying by the side of the wall of the structure of the sukkah, not a sukkah mitzvah, but just a regular hut, and that wood, those branches are not woven into the wall, halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah says you're permitted to go ahead and use them on Yom Tiv because they're not part of the structure. Not part of the structure. According to Rabbi Shimon, if you happen to have a rickety sukkah sukkah's mitzvah, and you feel this thing is not going to survive the Yom Tiv, when it does collapse, you would be permitted to go ahead and use the wood for some other purpose, in the same way that you're permitted to use the leftover oil in the nair. Incredible. Now, both say, we don't pass in that way, right? Because remember, again, last week we saw this. We pass by Hilchos Muktzah. If you're aser at Bein Hashmashas, then what? You're aser for the duration of Shabbos. So, for example, for our purposes, the leftover oil in the nair remains prohibited for the duration of Shabbos. Incredible. Both sides finish the sugya. V'shavin b'sokas achag b'chag shi'asura v'mhisna ala ha'kol fitna. Both say, now, we said in the Gemara quoted the Beitzah, that everyone agrees that when it comes to sukkah achag, both say, so sukkah achag is your sukkah. Sukkah you use on Yom Tiv, that it is prohibited or precluded from any other non-mitzvah use. But if you made a t'nai, which sounds like if you made a condition on Erev Yom Tiv to say, I'm going to get benefits from other parts of the sukkah, you're permitted to do so. The Gemara says, really? Does the Tanai work to allow you to get benefit from the sukkah? So listen to this. How do you know that the wood of your sukkah is asr all 7 days? I will say that the sukkah is prohibited from use. You can't get any mundane use from your sukkah all 7 days. The Gemara says, Shneimar Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem. Because the pasuk says Yom Tov Sukkos, 7 days will be for Hashem. The Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Minayim shekeshem shechal sheishamayim ala sukkah. Minayim shekeshem shechal sheishamayim ala chagiga, kach chal sheishamayim ala sukkah. How do we know that the same way that Shem Shemayim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's identity is Kedusha, devolves upon the carbon chagiga, that you cannot use a carbon chagiga for anything other than carbonic purposes, so too chal shim shamayim ala sukkah, that the structure itself becomes endowed with a heightened level of sanctity, which would preclude it from being used for anything else other than the mitzvah. Talmud lomar, Chag HaSukkos shivas yamim laHashem. The pasuk says the Yom Tov of Sukkos, 7 days will be for Hashem. Ma Chag laHashem, just ultimately as the Chagiga. Gemara says the Chag is Chagiga. The Chagiga is for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Af Sukkah laHashem. So too ultimately again the Sukkah is endowed with the Kedusha, making it Kulo laHashem and cannot be used for anything else. Amar Rav Menachem Mendel, Seifa Asan l'Sukkah da'alma. You're right. The Beitzah, when I said that you can get benefit from a sukkah, is not talking about the sukkah's mitzvah, right? It's not talking about a sukkah used for Yom Tov. What is it talking about? A hut, stam a hut. Aval sukkah de mitzvah lo bahani batna. I always say, but the sukkah of a mitzvah, right? A sukkah used for on sukkahs on Yom Tov, ultimately again a t'nai will not work for it. Is that true? I will say, if you make a t'nai, that will not allow you to use parts of the sukkah for mundane purposes. Here we go. It's an incredible sugya. Again, all of Hilchos Sukkah. All of Hilchos Sukkah on Isru Chag. Listen to this. V'asanya, we learn, Sichachal Kilchasa, if you made your sukkah appropriately, right? You put on appropriate schach, V'atra b'kramim b'sadin b'siyarin, and you adorned it, you decorated it with colored or embroidered sheets. V'tala bo'agozim, and you v'tala bo'agozim, shkedim, afarsikim, rimonim, parchili, anovim, yenos, shmanim, v'salsos, v'atros, shibalim, and we'll say you decorated your sukkah. You know, but in the good old days, they didn't use plastic fruit, right? They used the real thing. What would you decorate your sukkah? They will say, it's so beautiful, right? Nuts and almonds, and rimonim, right, pomegranates and clusters of grapes and bottles of wine and oil and fine flour and all different shivas aminim, right? You decorated your sukkah with all of this stuff. You are not permitted to eat from these items, to benefit from these items until Matzeh Yom Tov. But if you made a t'nai, right? They will say, what's that t'nai? If you made a t'nai and you said, I'm hanging up these decorations, but I reserve the right to benefit from them, hakol lefi to know. Oh, if you made it tonight, then tonight works. So we'll say, what do you see? You see that you can't make it tonight with sukkah to get benefit from sukkah. Oh, what's the case, Rabbi Say? The case is where you say, I am not separating myself from getting benefit from these items, all ben hashmashas. Rabbi Say, when does the muktzah status of an item devolve upon it? Ben hashmashas. If you actively remain engaged with the item, all ben hashmashas, that never allows the item to essentially become muktzah, to become set aside for non-use. To lo chala kedusha alayhu. Because the kedusha therefore never really devolved upon the decorations, the food decorations. Therefore you reserved the right to benefit from them. Aval, I'd say sukkah, the chala kedusha alayhu is katzai l'shiva. But the actual wood of the sukkah, where the kedusha of the Yom Tov did devolve upon them, those remain set aside for non-use for the entirety of Yom Tov. So we'll say, why is the case? So we'll say, so what we're establishing now is, if you go ahead and remain engaged with the edible decorations for Ben Hashmashas, they do not become prohibited. You could go ahead and benefit from them on Yom Tiv. The actual wood of the sukkah, you're not actively engaged with it, Ben Hashmoshes. Ultimately, again, that becomes hooked to the shiva. That becomes set aside for non-use all of Yom Tiv. So the Gemara said, but why is that different in the following case? So this will end. Well, let's listen to this case. Ditmar, Hifrish Shiva Esrogim L'Shiva Sayamim. Well, let's say you set aside 7 esrogim for 7 days, right? You want a different esrog for each day. Amarav, Kalachas V'achas Yotzev V'ochla L'alter. Rav says, no problem. Right after you fulfill the mitzvah with a particular esrog, you could eat it that day. Rav Asiyam, no. Kolachas v'achas yotzeba v'ochla l'machar. V'ochla l'machar. So Rav Asi says, no. You could eat it, but not that day. Not that day. In other words, you could fulfill the mitzvah, but that day that you use the esrog is hooked to the mitzvah. The next day, where you have a different esrog, ultimately, again, you can use it that day. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Now, here's what's interesting. The esrog was hooked to the mitzvah. Right? It's set aside for mitzvah. Yet, you're permitted to go ahead and eat it the next day. Now, b'pashtos, the reason for that is because you kind of made it tonight that you're only going to use the esrog for that day. To which the Gemara says, here's the difference. Hasam, demifsiku leilos miyamim, kol chad v'chad mitzvah ba'apei nafshei. So we'll say, here's the difference. See, I will say, esrog is not a continuous mitzvah all 7 days. Right? The mitzvah of esrog only applies when? Only applies when? By day. Every night, there is no mitzvah of esrog. Say, if Rabbi say, if you set aside an esrog for a particular day, halacha l'maisa, it's hooked to the mitzvah for that day. But once nightfall comes and the mitzvah is no longer in effect, the esrog, so to speak, loses its kedusha because you only designated it for the day. Hacha, when it comes to sukkah, the lo mifsiku leilos miyamim kulo kechad yom arich tadami. We'll say, by the way, we get 2 Yom Tiv references in one sugya, right? Yom arich Rosh Hashanah, sukkah, but by sukkah, we'll say it's like one long day legabe the mitzvah sukkah. Therefore, we'll say halacha l'maisa just by hilchos sukkah. Halacha l'maisa hilchos sukkah, we cannot get any benefit from the structure of the sukkah itself. We paskin kishem shechal shem shamayim ala chagiga. Same way the chagiga is kula kadosh, the structure of the sukkah is set aside for non-use for the entirety of Yom Tiv. When it comes to edible decorations, einachinami. If bein hashmashas you remain engaged with those decorations, then technically speaking, you could partake of them over the course of Yom Tiv as well. But bepashtos, that's not usually the case, and therefore the decorations also become huktas l'mitzvah for the duration of Yom Tiv as well. We'll say shekayach. We'll pick up with the Mishnah Mirat Hashem tomorrow. Something happens with the internet connection.
Okay, something.
It came back on, but it says like disruption or disconnected, reconnecting, OBS. It's an OBS disconnect. I don't know. I don't think.
I'll check it.